Right, everyone. So, as you know, part of this course, reading the research, is to also give you a good foundation in how to write using a scholarly voice and scholarly standards according to the American Psychological Association's guidelines, which are the dominant approach in education. So, you all have access to the APA manual, and I strongly encourage you to keep it on hand and refer to it throughout your entire program. It's much more of a reference guide as opposed to a book you just read, right? But because this is your first semester in the course, or in the EDD program, we really encourage you to actually read through it and get a sense of what APA is about. It's not just about how to properly format references and cite other scholars' material in what you write. So this presentation is to just give you a brief sense of this other part of what APA is, the writing style piece. So chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6 really get at some of the primary guidelines that APA manuscripts use. I'm only going to touch on some highlights from each of these chapters based on what I've seen other graduate students at ASU especially sort of not realize or struggle with in their own writing. So that's the purpose of this presentation. It's by no means a cumulative sort of detailed summary of everything. And so please, please, please look at, I know it's not the most exciting thing, but on your own time, please review the APA guidelines, particularly for this week, chapter 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so without further ado, okay, great. So I'm going to touch on, as I said, just a few things from each of the chapters. So first of all, chapter 4 is about writing style and grammar. Again, I'm sorry, this isn't the most exciting thing maybe that I can be presenting about, but really the important thing with APA and the important thing about the type of manuscripts you're going to be writing or to present sort of your own research eventually in your dissertation is that this is not some sort of this is not creative writing. This is a very straightforward, clear approach to writing. You want to be very logical, paying attention to this idea of continuity and flow. That's often to help sort of make your manuscript more logical to a reader. Transitional words can be helpful. There's some nice tips again in chapter 4 about how to improve sort of the continuity and flow of your writing. They touch upon sort of being careful about not overusing long clauses or long strings of nouns, etc. So I encourage you to look at that. But again, like kind of the main takeaway here is that really this is not about kind of surprising your reader. You want to be very logical in how you write about sort of your study, your research, or whatever the topic is that you're writing about. The other thing that's important is this notion of being concise and being clear. So this is often something I actually encounter more with my master's students, but a lot of times people in the academy or people who are aspiring academics think that to sound smart, I guess, people who sound smart write in very long sentences and are very complex ideas and etc. Actually, that is not great. So I'm sure you all have experienced this when you're reading something and you're just like, whoa, this sentence goes on for an entire paragraph, like 14 lines, and I just cannot follow what this person is saying. So often with graduate students, I'm saying, you know what, you need to sort of reduce kind of overall how you explain things into shorter, clearer sentences. All else being equal, it's easier for readers to understand. Of course, if you start writing in little short, choppy sentences, it kind of comes off as not having good flow to the other point above. But usually sort of for graduate students, I often encourage you to really critically look at how you're writing about a concept, an idea, and not have overly long sentences. a few things to sort of just little tips. Do not use contractions when you're writing. So don't use don't, use do not, use cannot. So spell out any words that are typically abbreviated in that way. And then it's also very important to define for your readers jargon or specialized terms. So that's kind of an art, right? Not a science. But for instance, though, you should be assuming that your readers for your dissertation, sort of are, professionals in the academy, but they maybe don't know sort of some of the specific concepts that you're exploring. So for instance, I know some of you are looking at sense of belonging. You're going to want to define what sense of belonging is, citing whatever scholar's version of sense of belonging you're using, right? That's kind of a specialized term. Or even I would argue, so those of you who are maybe examining complex sort of issues of race, equity, et cetera, like for instance, I know Geneva is creating or focusing on sort of improving faculty ability to think about equity in the classroom. So this notion of intersectionality is an important concept, right, in the academy right now when thinking about how to reduce bias and improve sort of inclusion in the classroom. Intersectionality, even though I think many of us now know what intersectionality is, that's still somewhat of a specialized term, and I would encourage you to define that. So this is kind of a maybe less concise way of giving you some tips around just generally with kind of the writing style of APA. The idea is this is not, a creative writing class where you want to surprise or kind of throw off your readers. You want to make it as easy as possible for someone to read about the work that you're doing. And the same is true when you're reading other people's studies and helping your colleagues, but then also being critical when you're reading other published manuscripts. Oftentimes scholars don't adhere to all of these standards. And so this is something to keep in mind as well in terms of having a critical eye on others' work. Okay, so then let me double check. Oh yeah, chapter 4 still has also some tips about grammar. So I'm not going to go through this table here, but I want you to make sure to look at table 4.1 around verb tense. This is something that's pretty straightforward, but oftentimes when you're writing, you're kind of like reading somebody else's study, and it's easy to kind of adapt and use the tense that they've used, or sort of, be thinking about things in the present when actually they happened in the past. So please make sure to review what APA says around verb tense, which is very important. And then the second piece here around grammar that I want to highlight is related to pronouns. I think I've already pointed this out, or Dennis and I have already pointed this out to y'all, but according to APA, you should not be writing in the third person about yourself. It is standard for APA, at least, to use the first person. So you don't want to say the researcher when you're talking about yourself. The researcher interviewed 4 participants. You say I interviewed 4 participants. So do not refer to yourself as the researcher or the author, etc. You should use the first person according to APA. In addition, and I'll get to this also, or this is also referred to in chapter 5 around bias-free language, but this is kind of weird, and it's probably not weird, but this is probably maybe different from what you originally learned when you were learning how to write. When you're referring to sort of a generic third person, if you don't know someone's gender, it used to be that the default was he, right? Or he/she. No longer. Use they, even if you're referring to a single person, but you don't know their gender. So they is the appropriate kind of omnibus pronoun at this sort of, stage of the APA 7th edition manual. So those are just 2 things to highlight. But again, there's a lot more in the APA manual, but these are things that I think are particularly useful and relevant and important for people who are starting their EDD program to realize about grammar. And then again, referring to, so all of chapter 5 addresses bias-free language. So this is kind of tricky in general because, like our standards, our cultural practices have evolved around in terms of how to refer to different groups and different people's identities. Often you want to be, all else being equal, sensitive to the people about whom you're writing and as specific as possible. So Generally, so again, APA goes through for each of these sort of identity categories I've listed here, or I guess demographic categories I've identified or I've listed here. APA has a lot of specific recommendations or sort of requirements. So I'm not going to go through them all here because you have the book, but I just want to point out a few things. So particularly around age, it's better now, it's recommended not to use sort of the omnibus term males and females. Be as, and this gets at this idea of intersectionality, be as specific as possible about which sort of gender terms you use based on someone's age. So for adults, you want to say men and women, or you would say boys and girls, or you maybe would say young men, young women. For adolescents, that type of thing, rather than sort of using the omnibus term males and females overall. Also, too, sort of, I know a few of you are doing projects. I think Sarah, maybe a project around study abroad for students with disability. So when you're referring to people with disabilities, it's fine to either phrase sort of your reference to them as person first. So maybe people with autism, or it's also fine to use the identity for identifier first. So an autistic person, that is all, both of those approaches are acceptable. And it also kind of makes it easier to read, right? So you're not always saying people with autism, people with XYZ. You can also use sort of the identity to refer to them first. And then also too, so gender overall, you just want to now avoid just assuming that gender is a binary construct. So again, as much as possible, try to be inclusive of people who are transgender or identify as having non-cisgender or different identities than sort of the traditional cisgender assumption that a lot of studies and a lot of scholars have made in the past. Also, so in terms of race and ethnicity, there's a lot of specific ways to write about people according to their racial identity and their ethnic groups. I've already referred some of you to these sections. You really need to review them. I'm not going to go through all in detail right now around race, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and generally intersectionality. There are, though, very particular ways to write about all of these groups and identities according to APA. So please, particularly if your topic of interest, your problem of practice is focused on a group identity or a particular demographic, please look at the APA Chapter 5 to ensure you're using bias-free language that is sensitive to individuals' identities. All right, hold on a minute. Okay, so then Chapter 6 gets at kind of, I guess, what they call the mechanics of style. So essentially, it's guidelines around punctuation, spelling, capitalization, when to italicize things, when to abbreviate things, how to use numbers, etc. So again, I'm not going to go through, it's a pretty long chapter. I'm not going through all of the details. They're pretty straightforward. I just want to highlight some considerations that I find often, again, graduate students at ASU don't realize sometimes. So when and when not to use punctuation. So this might be a surprise to you. In terms of periods, there's a whole list of times when you do and do not use them. I'm just highlighting a few here that I've found people don't realize. So surprise, not for academic degrees. You don't actually say PH period D period, nor do you say ED period D period. It's all combined, no periods, and when you're referencing degrees. So you will have an EDD without any periods in it, and I have a PhD without any periods in it. However, you do use periods when you're abbreviating Latin terms like E period G period or I period E period. So you want to put periods there. It's not just EG without any periods or IE without any periods. And then in addition, so, and this is for reference lists especially, so you want to put a period after the author's first name, and then also if they have a middle name, and include it after their second initial. So it shouldn't be just AUT-M, it should be AUT-M period. And then if I use my middle name, which is Christina, another period, which I don't, because I feel like it makes me look like a DJ. It looks weird. So anyways, so though you do want to put a period after the author's first names in your reference list, and if they include a middle initial after that as well. Another thing, as I mentioned, so this chapter goes through all of this stuff about capitalization. Most useful or relevant, I think, for all of you. Here, as you can see here on the screen, I copied the table actually about capitalization. So if you're referring to a specific disciplinary program, a specific university, or a specific course, you capitalize it. But if you're just talking vaguely about psychology or education or university, you do not capitalize those. So this is important for our work in higher ed especially. So if you're just saying a college, you don't capitalize that. But if you say, of course, Long Beach City College, you capitalize all of those, the college in that phrase. So as well, the same is true for academic titles. If you're just generally talking about, oh, I interviewed a bunch of professors, you wouldn't capitalize that. Or, you know, the dean of students said X, Y, and Z. You would actually not capitalize that, but you do capitalize it when you're talking about a specific person, like President Crow. But if you said Michael Crow, comma, the president of Arizona State University, you would not capitalize president there, because that's what APA says. I don't even know why, but that's what APA says. So you would capitalize President Crow, but you would not capitalize Michael Crow, comma, the president of Arizona State. You would not capitalize president in that phrase. So again, please, though, when you get the chance, look through this chapter, because there's also a lot more discussion of things when and when not to capitalize, when and when not to use punctuation. These are just the examples I wanted to highlight. I also, finally, a few additional things I want to highlight from this chapter. Okay, abbreviations generally, and there's a whole section, a long section in this chapter about abbreviations. Peruse it at your leisure. But the kind of rule of thumb overall is that you generally write out the full term for anything the first time you use it. Put the abbreviation after in parentheses, then after that, you just use the abbreviation. So probably every one of you is going to use the term Long Beach or the place, Long Beach City College, in your dissertations and a lot of your writing. You always want to write it out, even though I know you're just writing for myself and Dennis right now, but write it out, Long Beach City College, then in parentheses, LBCC, then after that, just use LBCC. Same is true for any abbreviation. So please start getting into the habit of doing that, because even though I know it seems ridiculous for this class, it still sort of creates a routine, and sort of it becomes instinctive for you when you're writing to do that. Also for numbers, again, there's a whole discussion, very long discussion in chapter 6 about how to write about numbers. The general rule right now in APA is you use numerals to write about anything from 10 or higher, and words for below 10. There's a few exceptions, but basically what that means is, let's say I'm saying, oh, I surveyed 9 students. I would write the word NINE, right? I surveyed 9 students. But if I surveyed 12 students, I would write the number 12. I surveyed 2 students. So usually 10, but if it's 10, you use the number 10 or above. But anytime a sentence begins with a number, you should spell it out. That is one exception that I often like to point out, because this is something students don't realize sometimes. So you don't, often it's just generally not good to start a sentence with a number, but whatever, it is what it is. Sometimes you have to. Make sure, though, to write out, even if the number is above 10, write out the word if you're starting the sentence with a word. So do not start a sentence with a number like 40%. Write out 40% in your text. So that's something that oftentimes, as I said, people screw up and don't realize, but that's what APA says. So we are going to follow their rules. So this is just a quick highlight, as I said, or I guess maybe lowlights. It's probably not the most exciting content for y'all, but this is really important, and we really need you to be starting to understand what APA's guidelines are for writing stylistically, in addition to developing out and referring to and citing other people's research. So hopefully this all makes sense and is a quick overview. If you have any questions, please let us know about anything in the APA manual that I didn't allude to here in this presentation. But again, please at least, do a quick scan of those chapters and then have this book on hand to refer back to over the next 3+ years as you continue on as an academic writer in education. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop this presentation now.